Good morning. Good morning, and welcome everyone, in particular our guests, speakers, and students from the PhD program, the master degree program, and the bachelor degree program. Welcome to the 8th annual International Human Rights Research Conference of the University of Padova Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca, and of its UNESCO Chair in Human Rights, Democracy, and Peace. I am Pietro de Perini. I guess some or many of you know me already, but I'm a researcher in international relations and have acted as the coordinator of the group of fellow scholars and practitioners who have put together this event over the last few months. And I'm glad to underline that this event has been organized with the precious support of this university department of political science, law, and international studies, the SPG department, and with the very active contribution of outstanding colleagues from other international academic human rights institute, namely the School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg, Sweden, the Human Rights Consortium from the University of London, UK, the UNESCO Chair in Human Security and Human Rights, or Human Rights and Human Security, University of Graz, the Institute of International Studies at the University of Wrocław, Poland, and last but not least, the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York, UK. So with these colleagues and with this institute, we have established a solid and long-standing bond of cooperation and engagement with the shared goal of advancing a human rights-based and policy and action-oriented approach to research, education, and dissemination on these matters, which I think it is fairly represented by the design and the contents of this event. So the conference this year, as you know, is dedicated to global civil societies, value and law power facing a crisis of values and law, ideas and action to shape an international order of peace. We consider that, despite their inherent contradiction and limits, civil society organizations and groups as a whole, on the whole, still remains a fundamental actor towards the creation of a social and international order of peace, justice, dignity, and equality, mostly through what we understand as their value power, which is their ability to influence the centers of political powers by leveraging the strength and primacy of universally agreed values. Power which rests substantially on international law as both a reference and a source of legitimation. And in a period when such values and the salience of international law appear to be, to use a euphemism, under a generalized attack almost everywhere, we decided to elaborate on this theme, to collect insights and questions, but not only on the state of health, on the current state of health of civil society groups and of the processes that depend on the effectivity of their action in the current international politics scenario, but also on ideas, perspectives, methodologies, and channels that these actors are exploring or already employing to bypass current obstacles and succeed in empowering individuals, communities, and peoples who are most directly affected in their dignity and right by this wealth of daunting trends, such as the wars we are witnessing, the enduring phase of human rights regression, democratic backsliding, the climate crisis, just to mention those who are most evident. So this is, in a nutshell, the type of discussion we hope to support with this conference, and we are looking forward to fruitful exchanges among our guest speakers, partners, panelists, and students. And having said that, very briefly, I am now very Pleased to give the floor to Marco Mascia, who's Professor of International Relations, the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights, Democracy and Peace, and of course, the president of the Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca. Professor Mascia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Pietro. Good morning, everyone, distinguished colleagues, dear students. I greet thanks to our colleagues from the partner universities for their scientific support. Let me advance special thanks to the keynote speaker, chairs, and panelists. I'm especially grateful to Professor Pietro de Perini for the scientific coordination of the conference and all the staff of the Human Rights Center for organizational support. Just a few words about the conference topics. With the birth of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the aftermath of the Second World War, the political leadership had laid the structural foundations to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The political leadership had solemnly stated that the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. End of the quote. The compass of humanity. Thanks to the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration, international human rights law and international criminal law were born and developed, expressing the will of states to let the force of law prevail over the law of force. On the old continent, the Council of Europe was founded in 1949 with the task of promoting and protecting human rights through the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedom. And in 1951, the process of European integration was initiated with the aim of overcoming state sovereignty, which was mainly responsible for the First and Second World Wars. Today, this architecture of institutions and human rights international norm created to promote democratic global governance is buried under the rubble of Gaza, Beirut, Kiev, Aleppo, Khartoum, and many other African cities. We are losing peace, and with peace, justice, freedom, and democracy. War is spreading along with war propaganda, which is forbidden by Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I quote, "Any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law." Wars not only kill, they fuel a mad course to rearmament, unprecedented since the fall of the Berlin Wall 35 years ago. Many governments work to undermine the very principle of multilateralism and destroy universal and regional system of human rights protection after having weakened and delegitimized them for so many years. They want to bring the system of international politics back into total anarchy and relaunch a project of a hierarchical, imperial international order where the law of force prevails over the force of law, hence a criminal project. At the opening of the general debate of the 79th session of the General Assembly, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, I quote, "The level of impunity in the world is politically indefensible and morally intolerable. Today, a growing number of governments feel entitled to trump international law, violate the United Nations Charter, international human rights law, and the decision of international courts, and nothing will happen." Impunity is the most significant obstacle to justice and reparation for victims and survivors of human rights violation and war crimes and crimes against humanity, often Omissions result in scenarios of total or partial impunity. Impunity fuels inequality, affects the most vulnerable, and undermines trust in political institutions and in domestic and international law. It is incomprehensible how democratic regimes punish common crimes within them while leaving the most horrendous crimes, such as war crimes and crimes against humanity, unpunished. It is no coincidence that the values on which the world order was founded with the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are now the subject of accusations of double standards by the BRICS. In the Kazan final declaration, the BRICS emphasize how the Western government has condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but has been immobile in adopting sanctions against Israel for the war in Gaza and the invasion of Lebanon. A double standard that, from the BRICS side, was formally denounced with South Africa accusation of genocide against Israel before the International Court of Justice. What is the international order? What Western government want? That of the criminals Putin and Netanyahu and many others, or that founded on the United Nations, international law, respect for the right of individual peoples, and the active participation of civil society organizations in national and international life? Western government must decide which side of history they want to be on. Faced with these wars, people have understood that the peace within states and the international peace are closely interconnected. War fueled a multiplicity of crises that, in the age of planetary interdependence, horizontally cross the borders of states, significantly weakening their capacity for governance. Examples are the economic and social crisis, the migration crisis, the climate crisis, as well as the crisis of the rule of law that is rapidly spreading, fueled by nationalism in Italy, Europe, and the rest of the world, like a pandemic, threatening the very resilience of democratic systems. This interconnectedness emerges in its full magnitude when we consider the norms and policies adopted by Western government to shrinking civic space. Over the past 10 years, an increasing number of governments have adopted legislation restricting civic space. This term refers to the set of conditions that allow civil society organizations and individuals to organize, participate, and communicate freely and without discrimination, and in so doing, influence decision-making process at all levels of governance. In other words, as Civicus Monitor said, open civic space means that people are able to exercise their civic rights and freedom, such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and peaceful assembly, and the right to participate in public life, while the shrinking of civic space refers to the upward global trend to restrict this space previously provided to independent civil society. On 17 October, Ms. Irene Khan, UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Opinion, presented the report, I quote, Global Threats to Freedom of Expression arising from the conflict in Gaza, to the UN General Assembly. She denounces how access to information about the conflict at the global level is undermined by attacks on journalists, by restriction on the media, by suppression of protest and dissent, by limitation of academic and artistic freedoms, by restriction of legitimate political expression in the name of fighting terrorism and anti-Semitism. The Special Rapporteur stated that no conflict in recent time has challenged freedom of expression so broadly and so far beyond his borders as the war in Gaza. She denounces discrimination and double standards that limit freedom of expression in support of Palestinian rights and suppress protest against the carnage in Gaza. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Turk, in a letter sent a few weeks ago to frontline defenders, wrote, "Around the world, force and violence are prevailing over reason and compassion. It pains me to see this dangerous trend, which has the potential for grave escalation on several fronts. And around the world, governments and others often use of force to target human rights defenders. Two truths must be unseemingly repeated. Governments that do not behave in compliance with the United Nations Charter and with the international human rights standard are operating in illegality. Those who at a very level of governance act to build an international order of peace as international law on his side, it is strong in legal as well as in international legitimacy. What ideas and actions the global civil society can and should put in place to shape an international order of peace? The various panels of the conference will have to try to answer this question by making concrete proposals. I want to emphasize that the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders states in Article 1, I quote, everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to promote and to strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at national and international levels, end of quote. So human rights have no borders. In a system of multi-level governance, the space for action is global, from the city to the United Nations. The method of action is always that of active nonviolence and of projectuality. Alliance with cities is crucial. Emblematic is the experience of the city of Graz and in Italy of the national network of local authorities for peace and human rights. Another fundamental alliance is with the world of formal and non-formal education. Investment in education and training is a structural and long-term investment. With report on Reimagine Our Future Together, a new social contract for education launched by UNESCO, said a world order anchored on the common values expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is weakening. Our world faces a crisis of values evidenced by the rise in corruption, intolerance, discrimination, and the normalization of violence at national and international level. This new social contract reads in the report must be grounded in human rights and based on principles of non-discrimination, social justice, respect for life, human dignity, and cultural diversity. It must encompass an ethic and of care and solidarity. It must strengthen education as a public endeavor and a common good. At the international level, we must fight to defend and strengthen both the multilateral architecture of global governance, starting with the United Nations, and the universal regional, national, and local system of human rights protection. Here again, a global alliance between international organizations and global civil society networks should be developed. Next year is the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. Italian local authorities, civil society, organizations, and academia, civil society organizations and academia will launch a campaign to promote a universal convention to strengthen and democratize the United Nations. The convention should be established by a General Assembly resolution with a mandate to draw up an organic document of proposal concerning the organs and function of the United Nations. The convention would thus take the form of an ad hoc body created by the General Assembly, composed not only of UN member states and specialized agencies, but also of a representative of national parliament, the European Parliament, supranational parliamentary assembly, local government, global civil society organization, and national human rights institutions. Dear colleague and dear student, today, even more so than yesterday, we must continue to be artisan and architect of peace in the awareness that those who study and strive for positive peace fulfill not only a moral duty, but also a legal obligation established by the United Nations Charter and international human rights law. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mascia, thank you, Marco, for having outlined in more detail the concept note of this event. I now give the floor to Sara Pennicino, Professor of Comparative Public Law and the chair, the president of the Master Degree Program in Human Rights and Multi-Level Governance at the University of Padova. Sara, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to the greetings session. I am the so-called president, which is an interesting Italian version of other English titles for those who coordinate a university program. Really, I am just a spokesperson. This is the result of a great collaboration among many colleagues, and some of them are here. Of course, Pietro is one of the pillars of the program. I have seen Paolo De Stefani, although I cannot see him anymore, but he's somewhere sitting in the crowd. The master degree I inherited really this role, and it is the result not only of the collaboration, but of a legacy that goes back to Antonio Papisca and that Marco Mascia has collected and consolidated over the years. And again, my role here is really to greet you, to welcome you to the University of Padua, and to explain what is the added value of having these initiatives organized to the benefit of our students of the master's degree in collaboration with the Human Rights Center. We try to implement as much as possible what we call a practice-oriented approach in teaching human rights in the master's degree. And one way in which we try to do this is by collaborating with the Human Rights Center and offering our students the possibility to be a part of all the activities that the Human Rights Center offers. And this is witnessed by a very successful projects that are very resilient, which in my experience in academia is one of the ways in which you assess the success of initiatives, if they are resilient, if they survive over the years. One of them is a very successful Padua model of the Universal Periodic Review. We have lots of collaborations with the Organization on Security Cooperation in Europe that engage our students thoroughly. We have a seminar series on human rights and investigative journalism, which is entitled To the Memory of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kushnirova. The instructor is here sitting in the room, so maybe you have an opportunity to meet with her as well. So again, I play a very little role in organizing this beautiful annual conference, but I am here to greet you, welcome you, and also to ask the master students to take full advantage of this opportunity, not only learning from what you will be listening from the speakers, but really take advantage of the coffee break. So speak with the speakers, because this is a unique opportunity to have all these people that approach human rights from a practical standpoint in the same room. So I hope this is not only useful, but also inspirational. So thank you and welcome again.
Okay, thank you, Sara, for joining this introductory panel and for linking it to the master degree program, which is probably the main target, the main beneficiary in our minds when we organize this conference. Before moving forward, let me just give you some additional information about the logistics and the content of the event, which follows a quite established structure over the years. I will now begin with the true opening plenary sessions, where our distinguished keynote speakers, who are Professor Nina Hall from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Professor Nina Reiners from the from the Norwegian Center of Human Rights, University of Oslo, and Professor Thomas Davies from City, University of London, will be challenged to tackle some fundamental aspects of the broader conceptual frame which we try to outline in this first session. They will be chaired and moderated by Peter Johansson from the School of Advanced Studies of the University of Gothenburg. After the keynote speeches, of course, there will be room for discussion, so please prepare your questions and comments because our speakers will be, of course, available to address them. So in the early afternoon, there will be a lunch for all participants here in the Basilica after the plenary session this morning. You're all invited. Well, in the early afternoon, we will resume our works in the Human Rights Center headquarters, which are not far from here, about 10 minutes walking distance in Via Beato Pellegrino. There we will have 2 consecutive sessions of parallel research panels, with papers selected by the scientific committee among a large number of very stimulating submissions. The first session starts at 2:30 p.m. and panels will address topics as the protection of civil society in the UN human rights system, digital advocacy, and mobilization in relation to the shrinking civic space, which is a key topic that was already mentioned, and the cooperation between civil society and local authorities to promote peace and human rights. The second session, after a well-deserved, I guess, coffee break, will start at 5 and deal with issues ranging from the innovation and threat in international social mobilization, the role and challenges of NGO in areas of conflict and influence and dynamic influence of social movements in the 21st century. We are really spoiled for choice, I guess. And okay, this will be the very intensive first day. Then tomorrow, Tuesday, we'll meet at 10 in another room again, in a theater, Teatro Ruzzante, which is not far from here again, about 5 minutes in Riviera Tito Livio. And there will be a roundtable, a plenary roundtable on a very strategic and relevant topic for the debate we are having in these days, that is the human rights education, and in particular human rights education at the university level. And this roundtable will put in action a crucial discussion among human rights educators, education scholars and practitioners, university students, and educator, broadly speaking, on how civil society can help making human rights education university a truly transformative process in the context that was outlined just a few minutes before with reference to the UNESCO report. So, of course, if you are unfamiliar with Padova, with the venues, you can refer to me and to our great team at the Human Rights Center, and that helped the scientific committee to organize this event over the last months. And before we start, I'd really like to take the opportunity to thank all of them, in particular our 2 wonderful Sophias, Luca, Katia, Donatella, our universal civil service volunteers and interns that joined the Human Rights Center for shorter periods. Thank you very much indeed. It would have been impossible to organize such an ambitious event without your precious and patient support. So thank you. And we look forward to start the conference. So I invite the panel, Peter, Nina, and Thomas to the panel. Thank you.
In this panel, Nina Hall is an assistant professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and her research explores the role of transitional advocacy and international organizations in international relations. and the research interest focus on a wide variety of topics such as climate change, disruptive innovation, international relations, politics, and women's rights. We also have Nina Reiners, who is an associate professor of human rights and social sciences at University of Oslo. She is currently also the head of department of and the head of research at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, which is one of our Nordic, very prestigious human rights centers. Her research is broadly engaged in questions related to agency and change in international relations and international law, human rights, and global justice. And she's also leading a research group on global challenges to human rights. Last but not least, we have Thomas Davies, who is a reader in international politics at City University, London, at the Department of International Politics. His work bridges historical and theoretical perspectives on world politics with special focus on transnational and non-state dimensions. He has a particular interest in the role of non-state actors in macro-historical change. So with that, I'm just going to say a few things about this session. We're going to start out with having Nina and Nina present. And then since this session is like 2.5 hours long, after the second presentation, we're going to have a very short break for everyone to be able to stand up and get the blood flowing a little bit. And hopefully you will be awake also when Thomas is speaking. So in that break, please don't wander off too much. Don't go outside and take do a guided tour in the city or whatever. Try to hang around here, but also make sure that you sort of get the blood flowing and you sort of be happy to be part also of the second part of this session. After we had the third presentation, we're going into a more interactive phase. And the first part of the interactive phase would be that the panel will comment and discuss among themselves for a period of time. And towards the end of the session, we're also going to have, I don't know, maybe 15 or so minutes for questions from the audience. I will remind you later on that when you ask questions, please make them precise and concise and don't go into a 10-minute background to your question so we have an opportunity to have as many questions as possible. But I will remind you again later on. And with that, I give the floor to Nina Hall.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for hosting us here. It's a real privilege to be in Padova. It's actually my first trip here, even though I'm based in Bologna at Johns Hopkins there. And I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you, particularly students in the room in the coffee break, as Sara said. Please come in and chat. My presentation today, as I was asked, was to speak on my work on digital advocacy. And to give a bit of context, I spent 5 years researching the ways in which a network of activists, so resonating with the themes of global civil society, I was interested in how a network of activists emerged at the international level who all shared the same form of activism. And it starts with a story. I was based in Berlin, and a friend of a friend told me about this group of activists that were meeting. They were actually meeting in Kreuzberg for a dinner, and I turned up, and I was fascinated. There were people from New Zealand, Germany, Hungary, South Africa, Poland. This is actually not the photo of them in Kreuzberg, but a subsequent photo of them in the Rocky Mountains in Canada, where I attended a conference. And what struck me about this group of activists is they all had exactly the same form of activism. And I'll describe this in my talk. They were what I call in the book digital advocacy organizations, often the first in their national context to pioneer using online petitions and analytic activism to campaign for progressive values, including human rights, including action on climate change. And it really struck me that it was what I discovered, a very distinctive form of activism that other scholars, I was building on people like David Karpf, a third generation of advocacy organization that's different from human rights defenders many of us in the room may be familiar with, like the Amnesty Internationals, Human Rights Watch. And so what I want to share today is a story of what I learned about their innovation, their model, what makes it distinct, how it diffused across the world, and progressive activists emulated this very distinct model from Israel to Sweden to New Zealand, where I'm from, to Hungary, South Africa. And in a way, maybe this is the positive part of my talk in some ways. And then I'm going to talk about two features which I think speak to the other elements of today's conference, which is the crisis part. And here I'm going to speak to how they faced a backlash as conservative actors actually emulated, or what I call copied, this model. Because we have to remember there's also a conservative global civil society, right? We don't just have progressive actors in global civil society. And the more I'm immersed in these sorts of spaces, I recognize we who are interested in things like human rights tend to focus on, I guess, what we would see as the good guys or girls. And I think it's important to acknowledge and learn about what the conservative or often anti-human rights, anti-UN organizations are actually copying models of activism from progressive actors. So that's going to be the second part of my talk. And then if I get to it, hopefully, within time, speak briefly to how some of the actors that I have studied, these digital activist organizations, have faced repression, even in democratic states, not just in democratic backsliding states, and some of the interesting responses and adaptation. So overall, the kind of message I want to give is like one of somewhat hope that we have progressive actors out there, but also acknowledging the challenges they're facing, right? Both from conservative actors as well as from repression. So what is this model I'm referring to in my talk? The actors I study, the digital advocacy organizations, are not defined by the fact they use digital technology. We all do, right? All NGOs, whether you're, Oxfam, Amnesty, NGOs many of you may speak to in later sessions, are using Twitter, social media, email to communicate. What makes the organizations distinct is they were all born in the digital era and could use the affordances of digital technology to engage in rapid response, multi-issue, member-driven campaigns. So I want to explain that briefly. What I mean by rapid response is these groups from one day to the next, from 1 hour to the next, could launch a new campaign. And in fact, I spent a lot of time in my research. I spent 5 years visiting many of these organizations' offices, and I'd go in one morning and they would have launched a campaign that they weren't even considering the day before. Now, this rapid response model is easy, obviously, because if you're setting up an online petition, it's very quick. And I think it's very distinct from the kinds of human rights defenders many of you may study, which is you have a long-term commitment to human rights. And therefore, you're planning on long-term horizons. You're thinking about what campaigns you want to run, what are the important issues coming up in UN forums. These groups are trying to spot opportunities or emerging crises, like I'll talk about the 2015 so-called refugee crisis, and galvanize people's attention to that cause. And this is an important part because they're multi-issue. They're not just focused on human rights or climate change or trade. They're campaigning across a number of progressive issues. Because as they see it, we don't live single issue lives, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, right? People who are progressive are galvanized by many different issues at different points in their time. Abortion may be an important at one point, gay marriage at another. This is very distinct from, at least in the international relations literature, how we think of NGOs and human rights advocates as being determined issue experts. And as we may hear from other presenters, going to the UN, having specific talking points, and being recognized not just for their moral values, if you like, for their moral commitment to a cause, but also for some degree of expertise, that if they were put in a room with a special rapporteur on a certain human rights issues, they would have specific asks because they would have that expertise. The groups that I'm studying here, that is not their form of activism. Rather, they're trying to channel their members' interests. So they're very member-driven. And how do they do it? They do it through analytic activism. This is a term from a colleague, Dave Karpf. They test campaigns regularly. So they can send out multiple campaigns in a week, and they'll see which campaign gets the most interest, which gets the most opens and the most action rates on a petition, right? And then they may even change the framing. They may try 2 campaigns, let's save the climate to save the penguins, or let's save the climate to save our grandchildren. Well, it turns out the penguins performs better on our, on our test, and therefore that's the framing we're going to use. So it's a form of campaigning that's highly geared to being reactive to what their members, who are people that subscribe to their emails, see as effective. And I should note here, I'm not advocating this form, I'm analytically describing it and distinguishing it from other forms of NGOs, and I will talk about the limitations of it. So part of my work has been outlining this model and clarifying its distinct nature compared to other NGOs. I want to just add a side note here, given the recent US elections. These groups are also very active in election campaigning. This is something we often don't talk about, at least in the international relations literature, which I sit in, is the role of NGOs in partisan politics. And in fact, Move On, which is an example of a digital advocacy organization, and Get Up in Australia are both seen as very powerful actors. Move On held the first presidential primary candidate debate, the last round of elections for the Democrats, and was heavily campaigning for Kamala Harris, fundraising lots of, millions of dollars for her and getting people out canvassing and door knocking. In Australia, Get Up was campaigning against Tony Abbott, a former prime minister, who ended up losing his seat. And he actually acknowledged that Get Up, this digital advocacy organization, had contributed to him not getting his seat. Now, this is a side note. I will come back to it at the end, but I think it's an important element around activism. It's not just issue-based, but it's also getting involved in partisan electoral politics. And the reason they do this is because this is when they see it matters most. When politicians are going for office, they are at their most vulnerable, and that's when they can really hold them to account and try to get progressives elected. So what does this all mean, this model? Well, in the book, I have lots of different examples. Just to give you one, I look at how being member-driven and rapid response, you can scale up campaigns very quickly. And I give the example of campaigns in 2015, September, when, as many of you will recall, there were a lot of debates around what European countries, but also countries across the world, should be doing to do with refugees crossing the Mediterranean. In the UK, an organization called 38 Degrees, this is like Move On, like Get Up, a digital advocacy organization, launched a petition overnight. They saw that there was a lot of interest in it was triggered partly by the image of Aylan Kurdi, the young Syrian toddler who washed up sadly dead on the shores in Turkey. And so they launched a petition which was distributed across the UK, asking local councils to welcome refugees. And they had a particular ask about wanting, at least 50 refugees in each city. Now, what they were able to do is very rapidly gather signatures for this campaign. So they got 137,000 signatories in a matter of a week or two, and also asked individuals to send emails to their members of parliament. And within a short space of time, they were actually part of a broader movement. So it's not just them operating on this. There was a lot of other civil society organizations, but the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, did agree to welcome 20,000 Syrian refugees. He made a special exception for Syrians in the next 4 to 5 years. So this example I use of showing how you can harness a moment to very quickly campaign on something, right? And this is what 38 Degrees did, tried to harness digitally networked power. Now, what I've described so far is a couple of the organizations. Just to give you some context, the groups that I study exist in over 20 countries now worldwide. Move On was the first in the US, Get Up subsequently in Australia, 38 Degrees in the UK, and there are other organizations in Germany. There's one in Italy, actually, Genova Che Ossa, which has just started relatively recently to be part of this network. And they claim over 20 million supporters worldwide. These are people that sign up and regularly get their emails, or 1 in 15 domestic voters. So they have a real global spread. In addition to having a global spread and a large membership, I want to emphasize that their campaigns are not just online. So while I talk about digital advocacy organizations, they also use email to mobilize people on the streets. So there were very strong campaigns, which I describe in the book, against various trade agreements, both in Europe, against TTIP and CETA. Campact, the organization in Germany, was one of the key actors in a coalition to try and mobilize people against these trade agreements, and had some of the largest protests since the Iraq War in Berlin. Also, in my own hometown, Wellington, there were large protests against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. but also in Poland, in context of closing civic space. Akcja Demokracja, a digital advocacy organization, was very involved in defending the rights of judges and also in the abortion rights movement. So far I've described these groups as kind of innovative, they're fast moving, they can mobilize thousands of people both online and on the streets. But there are tensions in this model. And one of the tensions that I really noticed was that while groups were very fast to pivot to run campaigns like the one I described in the UK to save refugees, they were also fast to drop campaigns that didn't sustain members' interest. So take the case again of 38 Degrees. I described them being mobilized to ask city councils to welcome refugees in the UK. But as they were testing emails with their members, over time they saw a drop in interest. Less people were opening the emails saying, let's save refugees. And rather, they were interested, the UK members of 38 Degrees, in saving the bees. Saving the bees is an issue that, for many of the members, was a consistent thing that they cared about. And we can, obviously normatively debate which is better, but what is analytically interesting to me here is that they're reacting to their members' interests. And their members are important because their members are funding the organization. They don't have philanthropic funders or governments funding them. So they, in some extent, in order to be sustainable, have to react to these members. So just as quickly as they can start campaigns, they can drop them. And the groups that I studied are not, they're not stupid. They were very well aware that this logic of member-driven campaigning had shortcomings. While it was rapid and reactive, they weren't able to transform their members' preferences. They were reacting to existing preferences of a largely progressive member base. This makes it easy to run popular campaigns. We talk about, progressive populism, but it was harder to campaign for minority rights issues, harder to campaign for really radical issues. And some of the groups in the network that I studied, that first image of everyone sitting in the room, started to modify the model. They started to try and look for ways to have more staff-driven, longer-term campaigns, still using digital technologies, still reacting to moments, and looking for ways to transform their members' preferences, to run sustained campaigns on minority rights issues. One good example of this is Get Up in Australia. So in the 2015 moment, they ran lots of campaigns saying, light the dark, let's welcome in refugees also into Australia, pushing a conservative government, similar dynamics to what we saw in the UK. But they continued, even if member interest waned, and even if there was bilateral opposition from both political parties in Australia to working on refugee rights. Get Up has run very strong campaigns to close down Australia's offshore detention centres, and has been part of very strategic campaigning to go after the funders, the banks that are supporting Manus Island and Nauru, the main detention centres where refugees are hosted. And they have been successful, and they ran a very powerful campaign in February 2016, where I happened to be in Australia at the time, against the government, where they had huge, massive support from civil society across Australia, and were able to protest against a number of young, often babies, who were on mainland Australia getting medical care and were going to be sent back to detention. So I give this an example of how, while we have a very distinctive model, the model can evolve over time. So I don't want you to walk away thinking that everyone in this network of digital advocacy organizations has continued to follow the same model. If you're interested, there's also an example in the book around Action Station in New Zealand, which has been very strong on campaigning for Māori rights. So another minority issue that didn't gain majority member support, but they were able to have some influence on that. So having finished the book, a lot of people at presentations that I give said, that's all very interesting. We know lots about progressive groups online, but what about the right? What are right-wing actors doing online? So I teamed up with two colleagues, Annette Heft and Michael Vaughan, who were both at the time based at the Weizenbaum Center for a Network Society in Berlin, working on transnational connections of the right. These are scholars who have much more expertise than me, particularly Annette Heft, who's worked on alt media spaces. And we asked the question, how is the right responding to this model of digital advocacy organization? And to what extent are they copying it? So it was started with an empirical question. And we went and we surveyed the literature. We asked all of the progressive advocacy organizations I studied if there were any copycats of their, or cases of similar cases on the right. And this is what we found. We found 4 cases where I argue there's direct emulation, where in the national context, right-wing actors have seen the power of these digital advocacy organizations and have sought to copy the model of organization. So not just the practices or the tactics and strategies, but the underlying model of being a member-driven, rapid response, multi-issue online campaigning platform. In Germany, the group is called Patriot Petition. Advance in Australia has been particularly strong. Also recently, and if any of you followed the referendum on The Voice, which was a referendum to try and give Aboriginals an institutionalized place within the Australian Parliament, Advance was very strongly campaigning against it. Grassfire is not a strong group. I'll just emphasize this. They have explicitly copied the Move On model. The Tea Party also actually interestingly copied the Move On model. And Grassfire continues to exist, but it's not a particularly strong organization in the US. But Citizen Go has copied Avaaz, which is the international digital advocacy organization. And of all the 4 cases, I would argue they're the strongest. So I'm just going to talk about them briefly to give you a sense of the sort of backlash and emulation of right-wing actors. If you're interested in getting more into this, it just got published a couple of weeks ago, so please feel free to read the longer form of the paper. So Citizen Go is an organization that is also similar to change.org. Nicola Ringhetti, who's at the University of Urbino, has also written on them, as has Phil Ayub and Christina Stockel, and their very good work. I should note that there's a growing literature right now on, in a way, conservative global civil society, and work by Phil Ayub and Christina Stockel is another really good place to look. They've got a recent book that's come out on this. So the contribution we make in this paper is we basically show how Citizen Go has copied the left's model. They similarly claim to be this grassroots movement. They have 18 million members. They campaign in 12 languages. And interestingly, as Nicola Ringhetti has shown, they're strongest in cases or countries which have right-wing populist leaders, places like Hungary. They're strong in Brazil, so they campaign a lot in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And you can go onto the website and read campaigns in your own native language. They have a strong anti-gender ideology. They've contributed just over 32 US million to anti-gender activities in Europe over a 10-year period. And I think the key point that we make in this article is that they are learning from the left's organizing, right? So they've got they often have similar type of model of their websites where they have online petitions that members can start as well as staff can start, but they're obviously have the polar opposite values, right? This is the interesting point. So they're learning even though they're political opponents. In this case, Citizen Go is running a campaign to stop the UN from scrapping the words feminine and women, yet they claim to defend women. This is a campaign often against, they run a lot of campaigns against the UN and for conservative or traditional family values. They have also run campaigns on other issues that are more domestically oriented. So I guess one question I would throw to, co-panelists, the audience, as the conversation continues is, how do we see the global civil society on the right, the anti-human rights global civil society? How do we understand their power? Do our theories and frameworks for understanding progressive actors also transfer? And what we suggest in this particular article is that there is learning happening across partisan divides, even if individuals aren't sharing these ideas because they're obviously political opponents, but the right is looking to outflank, to outcompete the left by copying a model of activism and obviously often innovating it, changing it. We can talk about some of the changes, but to try and beat their opponents. And I can speak a little bit, if anyone's interested, to how I see this playing out in the US, because I think a lot of the groups that are loose affiliates with the Trump administration, like the Heritage Foundation, we can also see some of these copying dynamics. So Tea Party, Heritage Foundation now has an action group called the Heritage Action, which is mobilizing grassroots American supporters. So in the last 8 minutes of my talk, I just want to speak about one further dynamic. So the organizations I've studied are scattered, or they're almost all in democratic states. So I don't have any cases in full authoritarian contexts. However, many of them are still facing forms of repression from the state. Now, this can come in the forms that many of us are more familiar with, sort of crackdowns on civil society, in terms of like actual repression, or in the Australian case, the police even went and, ordered by politicians, raided the offices of GetUp. In Poland, Action Demokracja, under the previous administration, has faced repression. In Hungary, obviously, limited space for the activists that are involved there and the group I've studied. And I think this is an important context for many of us in the room to be reflecting on. And I know my co-panelist Nina Reiners will also be speaking to this theme, that there is a broad scholarship arguing we're seeing a shrinking civic space. These are just a few of the scholars who have been working on this in the IR space. Supana Chowdhury has written a really interesting article tracing how states use what she calls administrative crackdowns, so administrative rules to limit the space for activists. And she makes a point that many countries have restrictions on foreign funding. I would asterisk that and say maybe restrictions isn't per se always negative. Some restrictions, is okay, but obviously there's a debate to be had about the form and the extent of restrictions on foreign funding, because as we know, in some countries like Russia or Hungary, there have been almost complete restrictions on foreign funding, which has really undermined the civil society sector because it's so difficult then to continue to do the work. So in this context of shrinking civic space, what has it meant for the progressive actors that I study and am interested in? Well, what's been interesting to note is some of them have had real challenges. So GetUp, that I mentioned at the beginning in Australia, they were basically told they could no longer have foreign individuals donating to them. And in fact, my father was donating to GetUp for a while, and he was told not only would he have to stop giving money to GetUp, my father's based in New Zealand citizen, he would actually have all his funding given back, all of the donations he'd already given, because the Australian government was concerned about foreign interference and saw GetUp as a powerful actor, and conservative politicians in Australia were really trying to restrict its power. But in response to this, I think what's interesting, and this is ending on a legal note, and to the lawyers in the room, of which I am not, I'm always interested to talk more about this. What I've seen is some really interesting innovations in how NGOs register legally. So the groups that I've studied, they're non-governmental organizations, they're permanent organizations with staff, and they have to register legally in order to get the funds. Some of them have made very explicit decisions, though, not to register as charities, not to curb the power that they have, being able to call out government action, being able to campaign during elections, by choosing to register as another political form. So an example of this is in New Zealand, Action Station, which is the digital advocacy organization like Move On, like Campact in New Zealand. They, I argue, made a preemptive decision when they were setting themselves up, so before any government interference occurred, to safeguard ourselves for the future by not relying on charitable status for their donations. And as they claim, it is our political independence that enables us to stand for the many different causes that we do, whether or not the powers that be are happy about it. Now, you might be thinking, this is kind of weird. This is New Zealand. Isn't, New Zealand this wonderful democratic heaven where, no corruption and civil society is flourishing? Well, just a side note here, which I cover in another article I'm working on at the moment, Greenpeace in New Zealand lost its charitable status. The Charities Commission of New Zealand ruled that it was getting too political. They had to go to the highest court in New Zealand to appeal, and they eventually did win, but some of their strategies and actions were seen as not charitable. So Action Station, well aware of what was happening to partner organizations around the world and to how politically sensitive it can be, how do we interpret what is acting in the public benefit and what qualifies as a charity, said we're not going to do that. We're going to register ourselves with another legal entity. So they preemptively did it. In Germany, another, democratic state where we don't tend to think of it in terms of democratic backsliding categories, they've also, the group that I study, Campact, had to change their legal status. So Campact was originally registered as a charity. Now, importantly, for those who are less familiar, a charity comes with significant tax benefits. Why do you register as a charity? Because when you give donations to a charity, in most countries, those donations are tax-free. So the organization receives more money. It also is often easier to get foundations to fund you if you're a charity, because they say you're not going to get involved in messy politicking, you're just going to do this charitable work. So you can get a lot more money. You can get more bang for your buck from your funders if you're registered as a charity. But the shortcomings of being a charity are that you're often more prescribed in the activities you can take part in. And in Germany, the German tax courts ruled on a TAC, which is another organization, an NGO, and said it could no longer have this charitable status in Germany, Gemeinnützigkeit. And Campact, as a German civil society organization, got worried that it was also going to lose its charitable status, and hence it changed its legal status. Reactively, it wasn't, told by the tax authorities, but it made a decision that it needed to change it, because otherwise it might not keep being able to engage in political education. And I think this phenomenon of how NGOs register is something really interesting to explore. There's a paper I'm working on, Following the Money and Following the Law, and how NGOs register. This is a broader pattern, I would argue, of NGOs registering with multiple statuses that isn't just true of the organizations I study. So I've looked in this paper at groups that include the UK and the US, how Amnesty, for instance, has both a charity and a company. Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, many of the sort of household names are choosing to have multiple statuses. And the argument I make in this paper, which is currently under review, is that they do this very proactively because they know that they want to get as much funding as they can from the charitable status. So they have one arm that's registered as a charity. As Amnesty UK says, the charitable trust enjoys significant benefits from this tax status, but it also operates under statutory regulation, which constrains what it can work on, the methods it can use, because it can't get involved in as much lobbying, and how it operates. Whereas the Amnesty UK section has fewer constraints and has more freedom in how it pursues its human rights mission, including activity not deemed charitable under UK law. Taken together, these two entities mean we can maximize our support for human rights, our voice, and our impact. So I guess a sort of rounding off point that I leave the room with, and as this is an active piece of research, I'm really interested, of other examples in other countries and contexts in the global South, particularly those of you who are coming from other contexts. I'd love to hear examples of if you see this relevant. But what I have read in the broader literature is this is something we see very often, whether it be in Russia, whether it be in Egypt, that NGOs are choosing to change their legal status in the face of shrinking civic space. That may be changing to a business model, or it may be changing away from a charity, or deregistering completely, right? That's also an option. And there's literature on it, which I cite here. I think this is also important, not just for understanding how NGOs can adapt and respond to shrinking civic space, but also understanding their role in partisan politics. Because if we look at all their different legal forms, not just their charitable form, we might see that they're actually engaging more in partisan politics, as I have examples in my work of Greenpeace, Move On, or Heritage. So in conclusion, I'm interested in the way global civil society has formed, has created, and how progressive activists have created what I argue is a new form of digital advocacy organization, which is very distinct from the Amnesties, the Oxfams, the Human Rights Watch of this world, and it's diffused worldwide in over 20 countries with millions of members. I do think there are shortcomings of this model. I am critical in the book of the strengths of, being able to rapidly mobilize has some strengths, but it also means you can be quick to pivot. I think it's interesting to note the emulation and learning that's happening across the political divide, and we should be thinking about that in many different contexts, not obviously just the contexts I'm studying, and not just with the actors that I'm studying, how a conservative global civil society is growing. And thirdly, I think it's important to look at the legal status of NGOs. The fact that they often have multiple statuses tells us something, and that these statuses they're often adding later. They're not all registering with multiple statuses at one point, but they're often preemptively or reactively reacting to their domestic contexts. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next presentations.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks also for the kind words of introduction. It's a great pleasure to share the panel with two scholars I really like and had the pleasure of connecting with in the past already. I will talk today about, well, this state I'm in right now, which is a lot of research has been done, and I'm about to start a new project, and you can help me think through this, a new project maybe. But in my previous research, I was actually studying exactly the theme of today's conference, which is the power of global civil society in, through their values and the law, for law in particular. I was very interested in individuals, for example, and the power of interpersonal relationships when trying to advance human rights. I conceptualized this later as transnational lawmaking coalitions, which is the book I published. And overall, I was very enthusiastic about this kind of power of civil society that I observed whenever I went to Geneva. But a bit like what Nina already hinted to, I could also observe that this power was visibly changing in Geneva on the premises, and that civil society was much more divided and polarized maybe over the years, as we would like to think of it when looking into our nice models of human rights advocacy and power in this regard. So my research then quickly turned towards the question, okay, so if we see that there is a shrinking civic space, about which I will talk in a minute as well, and more repression, more constraints on civil society, more polarization, who will actually benefit from this? Are there any other actors that might be pushing into this space? And the answer is yes for me. So there are a lot of private actors now taking on roles as human rights advocates with maybe a different understanding of human rights than we would like them to approach human rights at the international and domestic level. And this is leading to today's topic, which is less civil or more capitalist human rights advocacy in hard times. I give you an overview of the structure of my presentation. So first I want to say something why I think that we're having really hard times, and this is just what has been collected so far by IRR research. I think we already heard in the opening speech that especially given the current developments in wars around the world, wars and conflicts around the world, human rights advocacy is needed more than ever, so harder times are there. But we also see harder times in research in comparative politics, and I will show you some slides on that. I will also show you more what I understand as the shrinking civic space, and why I think also it goes beyond what can be measured in domestic legislations. And then I will talk a bit about the rise of private advocacy, but also question what these blurring boundaries between civil society engagement for human rights and private actors of advocacy for human rights might do to human rights. So if we talk about global governance in hard times, this is a collaborative project I have with a couple of colleagues right now in international relations who all make an argument on why these international institutions right now might be faced with especially hard times. Or harder times than usual. I think for us as human rights scholars, times had always been hard in a way. But we can see that there are some challenges identified in this project that I think are of particular relevance to those who study human rights institutions. So when we think about the change in state power distribution and the rise of authoritarianism and populism, we can already observe that at the international level, we see a push for reinterpretations of human rights, for example, towards more family values. Yeah, so a lot of actors that had previously maybe ignored what was happening in Geneva are now quite active. Russia is one example. China is also coming with their very own understanding of human rights now. And where these actors had been more passive in the past, they are now actively pushing for reinterpretations. We also see, of course, everywhere that states are actively contesting basic principles of human rights, like non-discrimination, rights for minorities in the Human Rights Council, in the UPR. So a changing distribution of state power and the rise of authoritarianism and populism is really a particular threat to human rights institutions. And then with every transnational crisis, human rights are at risk to become disregarded, to become violated, but in the name of security. So states see that also as legitimate. And then climate change, the prime example for a second order cooperation problem in global governance, challenges all the human rights monitoring institutions to assess state obligations for different rights, but it also reevaluates the relationship between human rights and the rights of nature. So these are all threats and these are all challenges where we need an active global civil society to hold up the standards of human rights and remind governmental actors, state actors of the law and the value power. And then another slide here from VDEM. This is an institute jointly hosted by Gothenburg and colleagues in Oslo, comparative politics scholars, who try to measure this, what we would call decline of democracies and rise of authoritarianism, and also see in which ways some states are at a threat to become less democratic, for example. And these are just some findings from the VDEM report in 2020. So we see that by 2022, already 72% of the world's population live in autocracies. And as you all know, civil society depends on an open system that allows organizations and individuals to advocate for rights. So usually in autocracies, we do not find these freedoms and liberties. So the world has more closed autocracies than liberal democracies today, for the first time in more than 2 decades. And there had been some drastic changes. And I'm not here to only spread negative, the negative words and emphasize what we just heard in the opening speech, but just to give you an idea that I think that all the models we have and all the scholarship we know about the progressive power of global civil society is really at a risk of becoming null and void, as we will not see these conditions for global civil society anymore. And this is not a domestic problem alone. This is happening as well on the grounds, at the premises of the United Nations. So again, international law, international human rights law depends on this institutional framework that the United Nations and other IOs provide. And these institutions also then play, of course, an enormous important role to come and claim that human rights were violated, that they should be better protected, that they should be further developed. And within this framework, we can see that also this space for civil society is shrinking. For one, because in ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, we have now seen, so they are responsible for giving accreditations to NGOs. Yeah, this is done in the ECOSOC, an intergovernmental entity of the United Nations. And in recent years, we see more and more denials of accreditations for NGOs. And this is just another forum, has become now another forum for power politics. So states are doing this because they are very neutral, so to say, what counts as an NGO. So the National Rifle Association from the United States is accredited with the United Nations, no? But one of the things they want to see is that you are non-governmental, so that you are independent in your operations from your government. And I'm from Germany, so there's one example from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation, which some of you might know. They have a lot of country offices, and their request for renewal of their accreditation status was blocked by Russia in that case, who said, well, you're a party foundation, close to the governing party at that point, so how can you be non-governmental? So we see ECOSOC and civil society accreditation already being under threat here. And then what I put up here from the International Service for Human Rights is a very interesting project together with the Geneva Academy in particular, where they collect under the hashtag End Reprisals, together with the Secretary General's office, instances of where civil society and human rights advocates and defenders were either denied access on the ground, were intimidated, or were otherwise, hindered, blocked from doing their actual job. And it's so worrying what you find in this report. And it really goes from not letting people access a meeting to brutal violence, physical violence. And this is happening at the United Nations, our palaces of hope that we're supposed to protect or are supposed to protect human rights and their defenders. So in this very grim picture, then again, this you already know, shrinking civic space, we know these legislations, and actually Suparna Chowdhury updated it for her book, which is coming out next year, and it's even worse than 2017. So also here, I cannot spread so much optimism, but just to say, our idea of global civil society has to be reevaluated. If we talk about the ideas and actions for global civil society to go forward, we cannot rest them on the idea that we have an independent and in high numbers active civil society. So again, my question then is, so who can help us out here? Who can support human rights? Who can advocate for human rights? Who can bring change? Because after all, I am an optimist in this regard. So what I'm doing is asking this question: who benefits from shrinking space and global governance? And I want to go towards the theory of capitalist advocacy. So those private actors that are not affected by domestic regulations shrinking the civic space, because they're private actors. They don't have to show basically what NGOs have to show. And we know that global governance institutions in the past, in particular, because legitimized through the Sustainable Development Goals, I will say something about this in a second, have really opened up also their doors towards private actors. No? We know that this can be beneficial when we think about business and human rights. It's important to have the corporations also involved in some ways. We know that consultancy are playing a lot of roles right now and influential roles in global governance institutions. We know that also about foundations. And I think like thinking about the Right to Health, World Health Organization, and the Gates Foundation as maybe a very prominent example for us all, where this can take, if done right, can have like good influence, but also raises some questions about the legitimacy, the accountability of these actors. And what I want to do in the future, and thankfully I received a grant to do so from the European Research Council, which I will start next January. For 5 years, I will study private law firms as transnational advocates. And in particular, private law firms, the big ones, when they are doing pro bono. So when they're providing their services for no or like a very low fee to those in need. And I think the motivation for these law firms, and I will talk a bit now about why we need to take them seriously as actors. This is one example. It's a survey report by one of the big ones, Latham & Watkins. So these big law firms are usually corporate law firms. So they're presenting like the big clients, oil firms, usually some with the resources. So those that make a lot of money, these clients. And pro bono traditionally with something, I don't know, like some of you might have also watched these movies or shows where like it's one lawyer from the Wall Street usually then helping out a civil society organization in the Bronx or wherever. And this is very much done on an individual ad hoc level. And that has changed completely over the last 10 to 15 years. There's wonderful research from colleagues in legal ethics who show how the internal structure of these law firms have changed, how they're professionalized. And we also see now, thanks to these kind of outputs, how they like really strategically monitor where they could offer these services. And from this report, I just took 3 quotes here to give you an idea why I think that this is very important. So for one, the motivation seems to be that they see something like a governance gap. So they say, oh yes, there is so much activity now of international courts and tribunals, but this has been largely uncoordinated. Then also they show that they see an opportunity here for lawyers to influence the formation of international law and precedent. And then, and that is what is interesting, they're going beyond their core qualification as lawyers to provide legal assistance, but they say, we want to go beyond litigation. So we want to prepare research for NGOs or finance some projects here. And we'll go to this in a second. So apparently there is also an opportunity to become an advocate beyond the core understanding of being a lawyer. And this all plays into this research program of private actors and global governance institutions. I will show now, as I said, like the project will be going on for 5 years. There will be positions also to fill in case here current master students are interested in doing a PhD in Oslo. But this is a paper that I am writing currently with a master student in Oslo, my research assistant, Ellen Vraalstad. So this is why you should talk to people during the coffee breaks as master students. So Ellen and I have this paper. When preparing the grant proposal, we actually realized that we have a lot of information now on not only what they're doing at a domestic level, but how they go on to influence global governance institutions. And as you just heard, this is my previous research interest, so we're writing this paper. I chose on the upper left side a picture that is from DLA Piper. It's another one of the big firms. When you click on like pro bono DLA Piper, this is what comes up. I think we can all agree in this room, knowing the literature on NGOs, critical NGOs, Global North working on Global South, that using children, in particular children of color, for promoting your activities is not how it should be done. And I think like NGOs know this already since the 90s. These law firms apparently don't. Yeah, and I was already talking about the SDGs. I think SDG 17 really, these partnerships for the goals opened the doors wide open for the influence of the private sector without the UN actually having a good idea of what this could possibly mean for the future. And human rights NGOs have been so outspoken about this, and it showed how they lowered the standards. I mean, L'Oréal is now advocating for women's rights and so on. So we could talk about this forever, but I just want to say we have to live now with the rise of private actors and global governance institutions. We also know that these international institutions face a very severe budget crisis. So the money of these private actors and the knowledge often is also very much welcome. At the same time, we have this shrinking civic space at the domestic and the international level. And yeah, as I said, it's very institutionalized now through partnerships that they can actually shape the future of international law and human rights in particular. I argue that we have to take these private law firms very seriously in particular, because we see here a conflict of interest that stems from the legal profession. So we can also ask questions on the legal expertise. Again, these are corporate lawyers. They're trained in private law, and now they're going on, and I will show some examples in a second, and doing human rights law or environmental law. Yeah, and so this is the framework overall. I will proceed, but feel free to ask more about the lawyers and the law firms. But here I want to show you our first findings in the paper. So we monitored all pro bono reports so far from the top 25 global law firms. I will expand that in the project to the top 100. But here you can also see patterns, like all of them, almost all of them engage with the international level. So they're not only doing pro bono in other jurisdictions, but this is what they're doing when they engage with the international level. And you can see these are the preferred institutions to engage with. So it's primarily the UN system, but also others. What issues do the firms engage on? And I think this is very important for us here. Human rights, maybe unsurprisingly, also because of the legal nature of the issue area, but also for environment and climate. I have to emphasize that this is a category that has, where they often work with the human rights system, in particular on the right to a healthy environment, which is a very interesting case I get to in a second. And what services do they offer? So here we can also see it's going beyond just legal assistance, legal research maybe. They're actively advising mandate holders like special rapporteurs. They're giving trainings for NGOs in the Global South that don't have the means to go to the UN premises. I was participating in one of these trainings. Yeah, and they also, like the unspecified, this is this primarily applies to when they were, like, let's say, not very clear about in their data what they actually did in this institution. And this is where it gets interesting for us. So we could argue in this crisis of global civil society, well, it's maybe better to have some actors supporting that and going through these actors to work and advocate for human rights than having non-advocacy at all. Yeah, and of course these are very skilled people. Yeah, they have graduated from the top law firms. They have an impressive network. So yeah, why not maybe using this as one of the ways out of the crisis right now for civil society? But these law firms prefer to advocate for human rights quite directly and without any partnerships at the international level. And they also don't have to. The doors are wide open. So let me go through at least one of the case studies. So we collected this data. This is the descriptive data to understand the patterns of their engagement with international institutions. And now, of course, we're interested in how can we observe these conflicts of interest, to what extent do we see them, and then maybe at some point say more about the implications. It's very interesting. So we correlate some data with this LS4CA. Do you know what that is? Law Students for Climate Action. So if it's a very great organization, and what they are doing is they're monitoring every year these top global law firms and give them a ranking how they, let's say, present bad clients or good clients. And A would be the green one, then you would be like only doing sustainable stuff as a corporate law firm, and F is very bad. And here we have already, like the first one I was talking about, a case study to the right to a healthy environment. So several firms were working on this. And you can see all these firms received an F, so the worst grade. So these are law firms that are like in no way sustainable in the corporate clients they present, but they were advising on this right to a healthy environment. And active, as you can see, they even get Dr. Boyd, who was the former special rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment, thanking, I'm grateful to Clifford Chance, the Van Center. So this is what is happening, yeah? And I was already getting the time. And to go forward, what I see is that you have to observe these conflicts of interest, for one on the firm level, but also on the individual lawyer's level. Yeah, it could be, of course, that an individual lawyer uses their power, their connection there to work for, like, very seriously on advancing the right to a healthy environment. Yeah? And then this could also become interesting for civil society to work together with them. But we need the project to find out more. Another case study is on the treaty that you see here, so on biodiversity in the high seas. It's the same, well, they received an F from this ranking, and present really a lot of fossil fuel stakeholders. So yeah, I think you get the message here. What could be potentially problematic with these new actors in global governance. So Ellen and I conclude for now in this paper on the questions we have, that they have become very actively engaged in global governance processes on human rights and the environment. They're advising and advocating for legal developments within global governance institutions, and they can do so directly. So they don't need any intermediaries. They don't need any NGO showing them how it's done. And we already observe these conflicts of interest, which are denied often by the law firms, because yes, it's the legal ethos to say everyone deserves legal assistance. We are just applying the law. There is no conflict of interest. And I know there are probably lawyers in the room, and they present this quite often to lawyers. So also feel free to tell me I'm wrong here, and come up with examples where it worked very well, because I'm interested in that. So this can have, of course, in my view, far-ranging consequences. It can really start leaving a trace in the further development of international law. But it's also probably even transforming the way we think about global governance and human rights, because they are so powerful actors, because the door is wide open, because of the budget cuts that force these institutions to collaborate if they want to continue their work. But I assume with the project that even with the best interests in mind, pro bono advocacy likely reinforces a very US-American, Eurocentric, and of course corporate perspective on international human rights law. And with this, I conclude, and thank you very much for listening.
And here is Dr. Thomas Davis for you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I am really honored to be able to present to you today. And I'll be looking at a slightly different direction in terms of sort of alternative approaches. I think we've seen two really interesting sets of alternative approaches, and I'll be moving on effectively, I think, to a third, especially with a sort of a view to the second question. The second question being, what ideas and actions are civil society organizations considering and proposing to adapt, resist, and overcome the current global scenario? And I'm in particular trying to look at ones that perhaps go beyond the sort of traditional sort of global governance arrangements. I will be starting off by saying a few words, drawing on my older historical research, indicating the need to perhaps go beyond some of the traditional top-down approaches that have been prevalent, especially in Western interpretations of the functioning of global civil society, and looking at some alternative sort of grassroots approaches. I think what I present touches on a number of the themes that were indicated in the introductory remarks, especially the importance of thinking about linking the local level to the global level, thinking about the role of education and learning, and thinking about various forms of networking processes. And I'm going to look at these especially from the perspective of those seeking to put forward alternative perspectives and ideas on ways of life and world ordering. And perhaps some of these challenge some traditional assumptions in relation to, say, the role of universality and universalism, and instead turning towards extending beyond that to a more sort of pluriversal set of perspectives and how those might be advanced. So thinking about mediation between worlds and alternative ways of action. So this is with a view that the current crisis in the liberal world order also is a crisis in, I suppose, the Westphalian world order as well, and the need to go beyond just sort of state-centric and intergovernmental approaches, which I suppose have been the traditional focus for global civil society actions. But what I will first talk about is, I suppose, perhaps some of the intellectual roots of this project. My early work on global civil society looked at, I suppose, its broad historical evolution over the last few centuries. Part of that work sought to challenge the idea that the roots can simply be understood in terms of origins within what might be termed a Western context. So traditional accounts of the origins of, say, 19th century international civil society, the evolution of international NGOs, turn to things that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. So for instance, the creation of the global anti-slavery movement over the course of the 18th, 19th centuries, or the role of the various revolutionary mobilizations in North America and Western Europe in the late 18th century. And then moving forward into the 19th century with the various international humanitarian and human rights organizations that developed. But one thing that I highlight in my historical work is that we shouldn't simply perceive these origins of so-called global civil society within that context. Such an approach neglects the learning processes that took place between East and West in the period leading up to the creation of associations, such as the global network of humane societies that developed in the late 18th century, and later became internationalized in organizations like the International Shipwreck Society. These institutions developed out of associations that had learned from, say, the experience of associations in China, such as Zhenjiang Life-Saving Association that you can see depicted here. So in some ways, the origins of some of the earliest humanitarian organizations need to be interpreted in respect of the role of origins beyond the Western context. The model of the early humane society was arguably taken from the Chinese context and adapted to the European one. So another thing I want to take from my sort of earlier historical work is, I said, some approaches that perhaps are the ones not to go down in relation to thinking about future action, one of which is the approach of the Union of International Associations that was operational and still operates in the present day in Belgium. This organization in the contemporary era is best known as for cataloging all the world's international NGOs, or at least all the ones they're familiar with. But in the period leading up to the First World War, they had all sorts of ambitious ideas for centralizing all kind of international civil society life, as we would now call it, or all international associations in a kind of single center. The picture in the middle at the bottom you can see here puts forward what they perceive as the advantages of having a single kind of coordinated center with fewer linkages rather than the sort of more networked approach that you can see in the much more pluralistic diagram. And the far corner, you can see the idea of the world being governed through a combination of sort of governments united in IGOs at the top and non-governmental organizations united in the Union of International Associations at the bottom. So these proposals did get somewhere. There were several conferences of all or many of the world's international NGOs, at least largely European ones, in the early years of the 20th century. But with the First World War, these ideas were not to materialize. But my argument is that such hierarchical approaches based on formal hierarchical NGOs are perhaps the wrong way to be looking and reflect a broader problem with anything that may involve attempts to emphasize the universal over perhaps the pluriversal or multiplicity of worlds and ways of living. So moving forward to, I suppose, the sort of classical literature on global civil society as it evolved into the later 20th century, we got, I suppose, two sort of state-centric models of action or the functioning of global civil society, especially developed in relation to rights promotion. The first model, the famous boomerang pattern of Keck and Sikkink, whereby a state's failure in one context is addressed through the actions of NGOs in other countries applying pressure from without, or I suppose the other model, the sort of hierarchical model of applying pressure from below for various global agreements, the various international human rights regimes. So in the 70s, Amnesty International's campaign against torture, later developing into the Global Convention Against Torture. Both of these foresee the operation of civil society within a state-centric world order in which states or configurations of states and intergovernmental agreements are the primary means of functioning and bringing about change. In terms of those who put forward more radical alternatives in the sort of later 20th century, many of these were influenced, I suppose, by more sorts of Marxian approaches. So you have, for instance, the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Movement, in part supported by the Soviet bloc. You have the radical approach of Samir Amin and the Third World Forum, which sort of promoted Marxian alternatives. Again, a focus very much on the hierarchy and the state in the form of, say, communistic forms of governance. Or you had networks such as the Third World Network that was developed in the 1980s that sought to promote alternatives to development, but again, largely through the targeting of established international development institutions and reforming them rather than going beyond them. Into the 21st century, one might argue that that 4 different types of models of global civil society were developed that are different from the approach that I'm about to go to next. So the 4 models that you can see here involve, I suppose, the first, the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, which is, I suppose, a reproduction of that earlier model of various NGOs in different countries collaborating across borders with the view to the formation of an intergovernmental authority for the protection of rights. On the other hand, you also have institutions for the strengthening of that shrinking civil society space that was identified in the previous presentations, such as Civicus. You have approaches that are centered around sort of intra-capitalist dynamics. We saw the examples of the role of law firms in the previous presentation, but we also have, for instance, various corporate social responsibility initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives, setting various labor standards, such as Fair Wear being one example of that, Fair Trade Foundation being another example. All of these private certification schemes are another mechanism of sort of intra-capitalist approaches to, say, rights promotion or the role of global civil society, extending beyond the sort of state-centric approach of the, say, Coalition for an International Criminal Court that seeks for an intergovernmental regime and its enforcement. And then in the early part of the 21st century, more radical alternatives were put forward by institutions such as the World Social Forum process, putting forward the notion that another world is possible and ideas for alternative globalization. In some ways, some of the activities of that link and correspond to those that I'm going to be looking forward to next. But one of the problems with the World Social Forum process was arguably that some people saw it as being co-opted, as eventually becoming an NGO trade fair. It's become much less relevant in the third decade of the 21st century than perhaps it was in the first. But in its place, we arguably have a whole new set of international civil society networks that are advancing what might be termed pluriversal alternatives in the 21st century, rather than setting forward a singular sort of narrative as to how the world order should be organized or as to how people should lead their lives and flourish. So I will especially be highlighting the global tapestry of alternatives subsequently, which is especially centered on groupings in India and in Mexico, but involves linkages across multiple networks around the world. But just to give you some further examples, you can see here, so Adelante, the Dialogue of Global Processes, was formed in 2021 to confront the current multiple global crises, to try to build people-centric alternatives, and it consists of 8 international networks in both Global North and Global South. The Global Dialogue for Systemic Change, on the other hand, was established in 2020 to share, analyze experiences, ideas, and alternatives in the face of growing health, social, economic, political, and environmental crises. Consists of 82 organizations and networks in the Global North and South. Intercol was established in 2016 to develop economic, social alternatives and environmental policies to rethink the world and paths of emancipation and solidarity. Multi-convergence of global networks was established in 2020 to build a more humane, balanced, ecologic, and democratic world of solidarity through what they term a process of multi-convergence of various different participating networks from very different backgrounds and worldviews. And Systemic Alternatives also seeks to build an interactive dialogue to try to shape the alternatives that are being developed by grassroots movements around the world. So all of what I just said there consisted of various quotes from the websites of these different institutions. And I suppose they're a different form of international networking through the web in large part. A lot of what they do is webinars between one another for the advancement of learning about alternative approaches to self-governance in the international order. So I've put forward here, and you'll find a sort of version of this in my recent International Political Sociology article, and I'm currently working on a book expanding on these sorts of approaches to global change. I'm highlighting the difference here between what I term the transformationist approach that you can see highlighted in dark blue in the final column, from the more classical reformist or revolutionary approaches to those who've sought to bring about change in the international order. So the reformist approach, you can see, tends to focus on political reform, lobbying, the advancement of new intergovernmental institutions. Revolutionary approaches, on the other hand, need perhaps less introduction. They also focus on governments, but are focused on world order change through overthrowing the government. Both are arguably sort of state-centric and universalistic in their orientation. They have perhaps a singular state-centric ontology that contrasts with the pluriversal ontology of these alternatives movements that I was talking about previously on that previous slide. So for these actors, the focus is less on the government as on societies around the world and horizontal learning processes among societal actors. The aim is to bring about change through, I suppose, a bottom-up grassroots action and a mutual facilitation of the flourishing of the persistence of alternatives to the sort of traditional approaches to ways of life. So horizontal exchange, learning, and cooperation with a view to, in the very, very long term, the transformation of an order, the gradual erosion, and effectively the minimization of a sort of state-centric and intergovernmental world order. Such ideas aren't necessarily new, as we will see shortly. But before I do go on to that, I just have a set of models also of the alternative sort of dynamics of global change involved in each of these processes. For reformists, it's through norm entrepreneurship and lobbying, I suppose the kind of norm life cycle of people like Finnemore and Sikik and so forth. Governments are at the center, processes of negotiation, and then later the monitoring of intergovernmental frameworks are critical. For the revolutionaries, changing government regimes, and then either revolutionary war or revolutionary consensus brings about new international structures. Transformationists are not, on the other hand, are not involved in that sort of directly antagonistic relationship with the existing order, but argue that it's possible for alternatives to flourish at the same time as the established order. So the idea is that you can build these alternatives without necessarily having to tear apart the status quo as a revolutionary would seek to. And as that could be also part of a survival strategy, that obviously the adoption of terrorist or violent tactics leads to a much greater likelihood of a repressive governmental response. So the aim in the case of these sorts of mobilizations is to bring about change through mutual learning processes from the bottom up. Similar sorts of ideas have been seen in European history. For instance, the various plans for a new alternative moral world put forward by Robert Owen, who had developed a set of sort of proto-socialist communities in Britain and North America in the early 19th century. They tried to sort of draw things up, build alternatives from scratch without any kind of previous basis. They tended to be very hierarchical ultimately in terms of how they were organized, and they were not to last very long in any case. But the idea was in these cases that through a sort of long-term learning process and everyone seeing how preferable these different ways of life were in the alternative communities, overnight communities, ultimately the old order would just disintegrate as people transformed their practices to these alternatives. Perhaps more effective is what I call the grounded transformationist approach put forward by groups like the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. It's grounded in it. Much of the knowledges and practices are ones that have been around for centuries or millennia, and the idea is that these need to interlink with one another in the context of globalization in order to learn from one another as to how they've managed to survive despite all the processes of globalization, the intrusions of, say, mining companies and so forth. So Ashish Kothari, who's one of the sort of leading people in this movement, puts forward the idea of a flower of transformation, multiple parallel bases of interlinked transformations by which community level action facilitates flourishing, whether economically, socially, and especially in tandem with the protection of nature. So the idea here is that you have an ever-expanding complex net of tapestries woven together by already existing communal or collective webs. That's the big difference from the so-called utopian transformationism of, say, the Owenite communities of the 19th century. Among the sort of participating groups include Vikab Sangam in India and Kriyantha Mutua in Mexico. And educational or mutual learning processes are central to the work of these actors. And so my very last slide, so I may even finish a little bit early, looks at some examples how it is that this sort of transformationist agenda is sort of advanced and promoted in practice amongst these various groups. One of the key sets of work amongst the Global Tapestry of Alternatives is simply disseminating information on the ideas and practices that are undertaken amongst the participating groups. Comunalidad is one of the ideas or practices that is widely circulated, as you can see from the second picture here. The International Conference on Comunalidad is an example of one of these networking processes for learning about one of the sets of ideas relevant to this. Comunalidad is often circulated as an example of how alternative practices have managed to survive despite, for instance, the intrusions of mining companies. For example, communities in Oaxaca have managed to survive despite intrusions dating all the way back to the Spanish conquest through persisting in their various communal assembly forms, their practices of communal work, and their recognition that human beings aren't necessarily just at the center, but part of the wider natural world in which they're situated. One feature is that they've become integrated or are integrated within the local governance structures, for instance, in Oaxaca, that have been able to deny permits to mining companies to to operate within their regions. So it's this linkage of, local level action and this integration in existing structures. So there's not sort of a total immediate rejection of the status quo. It's very different from a revolutionary perspective because there's a persistence of these alternative forms within established frameworks. So that's just one example that is used. Some people argue that it's possible to develop a notion of global comunalidad, whereby people can adapt such practices elsewhere. Groups associated with the global tapestry of alternatives also advocate and participate in many wider educational processes. For instance, Misak University that's depicted at the top, so alternative learning processes and many alternative processes of exchange between the participating groups. So just to highlight some of the other sorts of actors that have been involved in this transformationist approach, Kalpavriksha is one of the Indian participants in the global tapestry of alternatives. It's there that the flower of transformation was initially advanced. We do also see a number of compromises with the status quo to facilitate at least the survival in the short term, while the sort of broader global transformation agenda persists. Something I want to highlight in relation to that includes, for instance, the advancement of manifestos, like the manifesto for an eco-social energy transition, as opposed to, say, a green or clean energy transition, as put forward more popularly amongst the corporate world. So trying to mediate their ideas with the sorts of ideas that are more popular amongst the established worldviews. And then also groups like Rights and Resources International are particularly important in helping to facilitate the survival of such alternatives by, for instance, their role in trying to secure recognition of land rights. So they highlight that 2.5 billion people live in community arrangements around the world, and they directly manage over half of the world's land. And play a critical role in protecting the existing or persisting biodiversity that exists. But in terms of the amount of the world's land that's actually legally recognized as being owned by them, it's only 11%. So Rights and Resources, I suppose, work within the existing sort of legal frameworks to ensure that these territories are protected in the short term while they build alternatives with a view to longer term change. And in contrast to perhaps all of the sort of negative developments that have been highlighted over the last decade or so, legal recognition of land as being owned by indigenous Afro-descendant and local community structures in Asia, Africa, and Latin America has actually increased. So between 2015 and 2020, 100 million hectares was legally recognized over the course of that period. So arguably it's not as if we're completely seeing the rejection of the established order, but rather the use of particular facets of that order to, at least in the short term, ensure the defense and survival of these alternatives. And I would argue that that perhaps consists of an alternative form of political jiu-jitsu to the political jiu-jitsu emphasized in the nonviolent action literature, whereby you use the force of the opponent against themselves. The nonviolent action literature argues that by sticking to nonviolent tactics, then the force of the military will simply, of military action against, say, rights defenders will be counterproductive. It alienates third parties and such like. In this case, the force of the opponent is recognition of property or land rights. And through advancing recognition of these in relation to these various communities, then you're using the things on which the corporate actors rely for their own persistence. They're actually being used to support and defend these alternatives. So in terms of my sort of concluding remarks, a new international order of peace can't just rely on falling back on the sort of established processes of global governance or the sort of universalistic conceptions of global civil society of the past, but instead also need to take into account that there are multiple sort of worldviews and perspectives that are already being practiced, have already flourished, and are now building new ways to try to facilitate their survival and flourishing in the context of all of the various deleterious processes of mining intrusions and other problems that we're well aware about over the course of the last decades and even further beyond. And so they perhaps offer hope for a sort of more pluriversal and relational alternative to the sort of more universalistic and traditional and state-centric approach to human rights advancement. And so that concludes my presentation, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Well, wow, thank you so much, dear panelists, for very interesting and thought-provoking and informative presentations. And even more so, thank you for keeping the time. I don't think maybe once or twice before I've ever had a panel that has been so good at actually keeping to the time that they were allotted. So well done. And that leaves us with quite a lot of time for the two remaining parts of this panel. First, I would invite the panelists to comment and discuss between themselves for maybe 15 minutes or so, if they have so much more to say, reflecting on the presentations, and the three of them, maybe connecting them in some interesting way. And then we have roughly half an hour for questions from the audience. So start thinking already now about your questions. But first, who want to go first in the panel? Yeah, Nina.
Yeah, thank you to both the panelists. I found this a really enriching conversation, and I'll be short and brief. Nina Reyners, on your take on private law firms, I understand you're at the beginning of a long project, which is really exciting. To what extent are these actors engaging only in so-called progressive advocacy, or are they also engaging in conservative? I guess I'm interested because the suggestion you gave was that in their corporate arm, they're supporting the oil firms, but in their pro bono arm, they're fighting the good fight. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about, is the pro bono arm ever used also for, say, the conservative side? And I'd be interested if you have any reflections on how they're navigating that. I recognize it's very, very early on. And Thomas, on your presentation on these kind of alternative versions of global civil society that we're seeing emerging, and you focused on this global tapestry of alternatives as a network. When and how do you see them having power beyond their members? Like, how is this vision taking effect beyond the specifics of what I understood their information exchange or webinars? How does it get projected more broadly? And are there networks that you considered that you didn't include in this presentation that you think are having more of effect at kind of creating a vision, not just for their members? I'm also open to questions.
I continue, I guess, in the order of appearance. Yeah, thank you, Nina. And also thank you, Thomas. Sorry that I came in late. The bathroom line was so long. Yeah, I think picking up on the question that you asked me, Nina, I think I have a general reflection on what we understand as progressive and conservative. So my understanding is often when I hear presentations, and I guess that's also what influenced your research a lot, is that we look at it from a domestic democratic spectrum of here we have parties to the left and here we have parties to the right. I don't think this is, when it comes to human rights, so easy to locate advocates on the spectrum. I just last week attended a conference with people who are working on the freedom of religion and belief. And there you had so many different human rights advocates groups from very different belief and religious groups, but who are fundamentally agreeing on a lot of things and disagreeing on others. And yeah, so I think this would be my question right back. Where can we locate any understanding of progressive or conservative. I know, of course, what it's about for particular human rights, but I would say that this civil society advocacy has always been more towards the development of human rights and encountering more practices of human rights. And Tom's presentation, I think, is the right addition with the historical perspective on that. But I think what is new is that we see that we see actors trying to reinterpret what we already have and putting this under a more conservative, more trying to roll back already achieved standards. But I'm not sure what to make in the end of this. And the same goes for pro bono. Because there, I think we can see a lot of work done, and it's actually the terms they prefer to use is, of course, like supporting women, gender equality, like all this, but saying human rights, you will not see with every firm. Like it's still a term that they maybe don't want to see their work connected to. But my other point for the two of you was on the conference's theme of value power, because when I understand Tom, or like as I know your work and read it, this is what makes it in the end in particular effective and also against states reprisals, is that you have these activists that are coming in on the networks with like strong belief in certain values, whereas Nina looks at actors who, well, in the end don't really have any values. As you said, like the one day it's the refugee, the next day it's the bees. But that might also explain why they are not so successful and sustainable. So I would say that would be my question to both of you. Don't we need advocates with a strong belief in the values they're representing? And the same goes for these pro bono law firms, where I doubt that to see successful human rights and advocacy happening in the long run. I stop there, and I look very much forward to your questions.
Okay, so I would also start just by doing my questions rather than the answers. And my question is actually fairly similar to both, because in both cases they look largely at, I suppose, processes largely from the top down and from the global north, or at least it seemed a bit like that to me. So in the case of Open, initially it was largely about member-driven activism, and then later the sort of more long-term stuff was done by staff. But that's, I suppose, the staff get to decide what are the causes that are advocated. What about sort of causes beyond either the members or the staff interests? To what extent have they sort of reached out beyond their sort of geographical limits? To what extent do they incorporate perspectives from what looked like largely global north contexts in which they're situated, at least in the case of Open, are not so much talking about the right-wing networks. And then, yeah, I was just wondering to what extent can or has this been translated to other contexts? Do we see this rapid response sort of activism practiced beyond the context you described, beyond the right and beyond, I suppose, the sort of global north, left, as it were? And in relation to Nina Reiner's work, is a fairly similar question about, here we see sort of the reproduction of sort of global north interests, arguably. Again, you talked about how they do pro bono work, say for NGOs working in the global south. Are these northern NGOs working in the global south, or global south NGOs working in the global south? And do they, beyond just providing things like legal advice, do they actively consult? Is there any sort of grassroots engagement with the needs or the requests of those whom they may seek to serve?
Yeah, well, I'll have a quick go at answering. On this question about the open network, which my presentation didn't elaborate, but that first image was of a group of activists behind a banner saying open. And that was the network that brought together these individual national digital advocacy organizations to form a global network. So Move On, Campact, 38 Degrees, those examples were part of a global network. And what you were interesting and right to point out is to ask, well, is this just a global north phenomenon. Most of the examples I gave were US, Australia, UK, and it is true they've been biggest and strongest in the global north. But in the book, and what I didn't get to in the presentation, is that they have diffused to global south. So South Africa is one example, but in the last few years, the network as a whole has actively promoted this model in Latin America specifically. So there are new organizations in Mexico, Colombia, Puerto Rico that have just joined the network. They have made quite strong attempts to also do it, create digital advocacy organizations in Nepal and Indonesia. So I guess my response would be, while the model has been strongest in the global north, and there have been a lot of discussions, is it more feasible to be member funded? Is it more feasible to have organizations that are predominantly campaigning online in the global north? There have also been innovations in the global south. And one of the interesting things to see in the digital space is that global south countries sometimes leapfrog, as in they innovate and jump to a new form before global north gets there. A concrete example of this is Amandla Mobi in South Africa that started texting and using text messaging much more than emails because their members were predominantly working class Black women. So the longer answer is, I think that this model has been strong in the global north, but I think there is good reason to see digital advocacy, rapid response models working, maybe with slightly different communication tools in the global south. And in that way, yes, they may incorporate perspectives, but I think there are still a lot of internal divides, whether they be linguistic divides or who has the most money in the network, the global north groups do. That is a really hard tension. And I think this is a tension not just for open, but for a lot of networks, right? When we study transnational advocacy networks, and Nina Reiners and I are putting together a forum on this, and one of the contributions is exploring some of those internal tensions in networks to do with some of the power within them. On the question that Nina Reiners posed to me about progressive versus conservative, and I think you're right to point out, these are complicated categories. And in fact, there is a book coming out by a colleague, Alice Matone, exploring progressive politics and questioning what is progressive. I mean, we could have a whole discussion about that in parallel, maybe at the coffee break. And I am using a more US Western conception. And I think it is really important for us all to problematize those distinctions and to recognize that there are organizations that may, or entities that may cooperate that we don't expect. So I think I would point to Clifford Bobb's work, where he talks about the Baptist Burqa network that engages at the UN on promoting traditional family values. So these are groups of Baptist churches and Islamic groups that work closely together. So they may have very different conceptions in other spaces, but are working. And I do think more fine-grained analysis of who are involved in these actions and not splitting it so simply as I did in this presentation is really important. And I'm interested in other people's in the rooms, what your work and how you see the cleavages, because understanding different cleavages in different societies is really important. So thanks for the questions.
Yes, so I already gave an answer, I think, to Nina. And to Tom, just briefly, yes, so my concern is, of course, that we see a reproduction of norms that these law firms would like to see embedded more strongly in domestic jurisdictions. I already have a lot of examples for that, but I can just say that at least what we can see is that whenever they go into a new jurisdiction to shape domestic processes, for example, on the right to a healthy environment, of course, they know that they need partners to do so. And this can provide opportunities. This is maybe where the optimism comes in. This can provide opportunities for local organizations, for local human rights defenders, also for people just with local knowledge. So they are also collaborating with domestic lawyers. But the way this functions is, at least in the cases I've seen now, and again, this is a project that will start next year and go on for 5 years, so I hope to get many more insights here, but I would refer to that as more of co-optation than actually collaboration and any empowerment opportunities. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
And thank you both for your very helpful questions. So in terms of addressing the issue of how do you see them sort of having influence or impact, I suppose, beyond their members, one part of the answer is simply many of these have only been around for like 5 or so years. So obviously the amount of time period in which you can evaluate sort of impact is, as things stand, relatively limited. But what we can say is that we've seen their expanding scope and reach in terms of how many participants they have. So it's clearly having an influence, because otherwise new groups wouldn't join. For instance, Mascia, based in Southeast Asia, joining the global tapestry of alternatives as a weaver alongside Kaupovich and Kriatha Mutua. We can also refer to also the ways in which they have had an impact in terms of developing shared manifestos with wider actors, like that manifesto for an eco-social transition. So sort of translating these things to audiences that otherwise would not be receptive, which I suppose might also include people like me in the global north. Furthermore, we can talk about the second question and the values power and the role of strong beliefs being central. But what I would like to emphasize is it's not enough for the beliefs to be strong. So the Owenite communities had very strong beliefs. They had a very clear vision for action and strong beliefs in that, but they didn't have the sort of deeply rooted, established practices that are the emphasis of the groups I'm looking at in this, at least in this presentation and in the paper and in the book that will come later. So in this sense, whereas I gave a sort of short-term these have not been around long answer for the first question. In another sense, they've been around a long time, and that in part underpins their strength in terms of the sort of ideas and practices that they're disseminating.
Thank you very much. And I think now we will move over to getting questions from the audience. Do we have someone who will run around with a microphone? Thank you, great. So, who wants to go first? I hope I didn't scare you off by telling you off not to have monologues, etc., etc. Of course, you can introduce your question, but you also know sometimes it takes 10 minutes to ask a question, and we don't want that. So, who want to go first? The floor will be yours. Yes, thank you. And I think we will try to maybe collect 3 questions or so. So, if there are anyone else, yes. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Hi, my name is. Oops, I'm collapsing. My name is Robin Ramcharan. I'm based in Thailand. So I wonder if thank you for your very interesting presentations. I wonder if either one of you or all of you have had a chance to think about, we are in the middle of or the start of a new Cold War, I would argue. And how do we think about new technologies and how they will impact all of this? And what I mean is whether it's quantum computing or artificial intelligence or developments in neuroscience and neurotechnology. I think, for example, of the software Pegasus and its ability to spy on us and so on. So I think you get the sense of where I'm going in. Thank you.
Second question over here at the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Sara and I'm a second-year PhD student. And my question is pertaining to civil society and the accountability of power. And in your opinion, how can civil society organizations hold powerful governments and companies accountable, especially when these actors can sometimes try to avoid or even shape these laws? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Corinne in blue over there, the 3. And then I think we respond to the question and then I will take the rest coming up.
Thank you. I'm Corinne Lennox from Human Rights Consortium at University of London. Thank you for a really outstanding panel. I really enjoyed all of the papers. Hence, Peter, if you'll permit me, I have a question for each. For Nina Hall, can you tell us a bit more about the genesis of some of these organizations and if there's any democratic aspect to that? Because one has the sense that they're not rooted in some deeper mandate. For Nina Reiners, I was intrigued when you put up the slide that said OHCHR was the largest space of engagement of these, but your examples were on environmental issues. Can you share some in other aspects? Like, is it mostly treaty bodies or other aspects of OHCHR? And for Thomas, I was intrigued by the point about the land rights mobilization. And I was thinking that so much of the progress on title is rooted in international processes of global governance or recognition of those rights. So how do these local levels reach up at all to that level, to that international normative level, or are they just developing vernacular ideas of what that is and pursuing that? Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe we can take the answer to these questions first, and then we move in with more questions. Who want to go first?
I can start. Thank you. Start maybe with with the last question. So these human rights issues, like the first case study is coded as a human rights issue. The right to a healthy environment is where we see most of the activities of these law firms, because this, of course, opens up opportunities to shape the international framework. And this is where they are most interested in, again, because most of the corporate, like that's my assumption, because most of the corporate clients are working in areas that affect such a right to a healthy environment. And we saw a lot of collaboration here, for example, with the special mandate holders on climate change, on the right to a healthy environment. But we also see, so there are examples, for example, on the situation of children living in the streets in India, where they provided legal research assistance together with an NGO. So this can also, of course, be seen because this was a company that also has clients operating in India. And yeah, so it's often, I think like most of the cases we see are in this more evolving human rights fields, overlapping with environment and climate change, but also very classical, like supporting women's rights, supporting children's rights. Oh, Sara, yeah, this is of course like if I would have the answer to that, I would have research funding for the next 50 years. How can civil society hold governments and companies accountable? So I think this is something where it's getting very tough for us these days, because every success story will be countered by a lot of stories that show that this is not the case. I do think that it's still, or like what we observe where advocacy has been quite successful in the past, is where we can see people really representing authentic claims based on their lived experiences. So I work and live in Norway now, and I'm always amazed when I meet our students who are from the Sami population, for example, and representatives. So everything they achieved in terms of indigenous rights, and there are still horrible things ongoing, even in a country like Norway. So I think this is where I see strategies working out quite clearly, but yeah, being authentic companies there, I think it also is still a big crucial role is to go and form coalitions and networks with other actors. That it's very difficult to achieve things on your own. Robin, yeah, it's of course. I mean, this is for human rights even a bigger issue. I was talking about the second order problems, and I think technology, AI, all this is playing into this. We see already that all this software, all these tools can have grave consequences for human rights, but also challenge fundamental values like non-discrimination. No? So even if it's not software from the state, it's I'm thinking about this example, like where you have like the soap dispenser, and it would not give you soap when you're with a darker skin color, for example. So this is a human rights issue par excellence, and it's not even about big Pegasus projects. It's just where we see that technology and AI, what promises to be a progression, can actually be quite harmful. So yeah.
Okay, so I'll just say a few words about the question of how do they sort of try to hold companies, et cetera, to account, or just taking forward some of the things I mentioned in the presentation in terms of what is sort of observable amongst established practices. Part of it is sort of the co-optation of the things that these corporate actors themselves rely on, like government structures or property and land rights, but integrating themselves within these, say, local government structures, or securing recognition of their land or property rights. And linked to that is the other question that was asked to me about how do they link to the global level. The work of bodies like Rights and Resources Initiative links very much to the global level in that they advocate for regimes for indigenous rights internationally, as well as helping to facilitate the work at the community level. And besides that, another sort of linkage is more sort of discursive in the sense of providing alternative framings of things like energy transitions, like that manifesto. So at the discursive level, providing alternative framings of objectives in global governance with a view to say whatever might replace the millennium and then later sustainable development goals in 2030 and beyond.
Thanks for the 3 excellent questions. Robin, on your first question, this is fortunate for me because I have a book coming out on this question, which is, it's called, with a co-author, Mette Alstrup San Giovanni at Cambridge University. We've written, it's a short book on digital technology, climate activism, and organizational change. So it focuses on the ways that digital technology is helping and hindering climate activists. I would say that some of the themes are true for activists in other spaces. So it was just that the editors of the special issue wanted us to focus on climate change. And what we find collectively in this book is that technology can help organizations and activists and human rights defenders, I would argue too, to fundraise more effectively. So you can obviously, get lots of funding very quickly with online platforms, often to form and to network. You can do more effective lobbying, mobilizing people. So a lot of my work is on mobilizing, but also monitoring and enforcing international law. And that's what Mette's worked a lot on. So you can use satellite technology, for instance, to figure out where illegal deforestation is occurring, illegal fishing. Indigenous groups, for instance, are using it to track where deforestation is happening in the Amazon. These are the sorts of examples that we use in the positive sense, but we also have a whole chapter on the downsides, right? We talk about extractivism because obviously digital technologies use a huge amount of energy, from cloud computing, AI. They also, as you point out with Pegasus, they can be used by the state to repress. But I think, and so a big chunk of the book is exploring the downsides. I would say, just ending on that note, Jennifer Earle's work on digital repression is really good because she looks as a sociologist at how, while the state can use technology to repress, there's also a learning dynamic where activists themselves are learning how to navigate it. So we shouldn't just see it as a one-way street. So I would really encourage you to look at her work. And Anita Gerdes as well is writing a lot in this space. On, Sarah, the second question, civil society, how to hold them accountable. I think one learning I took from my book is that the nation state remains really important. Even if we're looking at global processes at the UN and we're talking about global civil society, the learning, at least in my cases, was that groups that use digital technology, that care about progressive values, however we're going to term those, and are interested in international solidarity, still see that they have the most power unifying as citizens to put pressure on elected politicians and holding those politicians to account. So all of the groups that I study are basically national groups. Move On is focused in the US with American citizens putting pressure on American elected officials. Campact is in Germany, uniting Germans to put pressure on the German government. 38 Degrees is putting pressure on the UK government. Amandla Mobi on the South African, because they are in democratic states. So maybe there are examples elsewhere where you have to think about boomerang theory and the power of other organizations. But I guess the subtitle of my book really speaks to that theme. So while I look at transnational advocacy, I'm really interested in how, in order to get global action, you need that national level. I'm happy to speak more about it because it was something that really struck me throughout my research. And the third point, thanks, Corinne, for your question. What is the genesis of these organizations? Are they rooted in any mandate? They can come across as very opportunistic, as just floating around and trying to capture things. What struck me is a lot of the people, and I did over 100 interviews with the founders of these organizations, often come from activist movements. They come from Oxfam or in Poland, climate movements, where they're frustrated with the existing model, where they actually feel like, you know, in Eastern Europe, a lot of the NGOs there are receiving mostly Western European money, and those NGOs don't have a mandate, the older form of NGOs. So they actually, Action Demokracja explicitly set up in Poland with members who are Polish citizens funding the organization. So they would claim, we can debate this, they would claim they have a better mandate. And actually that comes back, you know, their members are individual citizens giving them money. Now, the question I think that is worth asking is, well, what is their model of membership? Because members are just signing a petition or giving money, and they don't always identify as members of that organization. And if any of you are interested, I would recommend Dana Fisher's work on American resistance, which is even more relevant probably after last week's election. She looked at resistance to the first Trump administration and did a number of interviews as a sociologist with people taking part in massive protests, March for Science, March for Our Lives. And what she found is that the groups I study, like Move On, were pivotal in mobilizing people for those marches. But a lot of individuals didn't conceive of themselves as members. So it's not like when you pay money to Greenpeace or to Rotary and you conceive of yourself as a member. So I would say that this is both an advantage and a disadvantage in their model, that the membership link is weaker to the organization, but the organizations do conceive of themselves as having a mandate, which is directly given by those individuals that follow them online and give them money. Happy to clarify any of that at the break, but thanks for the questions.
Right, so we can have another round of questions. I have two people already on my list. First, the lady in red over there, and then the gentleman over there on the third row. And then I have two more people, and then we will take to answer those questions if we can.
Thank you. My name is Vanessa. I'm a political science, international relations and human rights student here in Padova. And my question is, when and how did this democracy shrinkage begin?
Thank you. My name is Alexandre Mortelet, and I'm from the University of Luxembourg. I have a direct question for Dr. Davis. Would you agree that we have witnessed a kind of shift from transnational advocacy efforts to transcalar advocacy practices? Linking this with the concept of NGOtization, don't you think that domestic NGOs, because they have become even more professionalized, tend to have multi-directional and multi-scale positionality? Thank you.
So, next person just in front of you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anna Cichecka. I'm based at the University of Wrocław in Poland, and I have two questions to Nina's. Firstly, to Nina Reiners. Nina, you mentioned that you participated in a training of law firms dedicated to global south countries. Can you tell us a little bit more? Was it like top-down lesson and lawyers presented themselves as they know best what to do or not? And to Nina, Nina, you mentioned about the response of right-wing oriented actions, movements, and groups. My question is, do you know anything about the reaction of this left-wing camp? Do they know about copycats? And if so, do they react? And if so, how? Thank you.
And then last question from Pierre Giuseppe over there.
Hello, my name is Pier Giuseppe Parisi. I'm from the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York. Thank you very much for the three presentations. They were brilliant. But I've got a couple of questions for the two Ninas. So the first one is addressed to Nina Hall. And I was wondering, so to what extent can these campaigns be controlled in some way? So to what extent, in a way, those that set up these campaigns retain a sort of ownership? And I wonder whether you've come across cases of campaigns that are, yes, very quickly set up, but then is like co-opted by other, I don't know, like other, for example, prominent figures or certain sections of civil society. And then to Nina Reiner, so I think you alluded to the fact that law firms don't simply provide certain services, but they also provide funding. And I was wondering to whether you found examples of law firms that are able to basically dictate the agenda in the same way that funders sometimes dictated the agenda of NGOs or civil society organizations. Thanks.
Do you want to go first, Thomas?
Okay, so I'll answer a couple of those questions. First of all, there was a question about when and how did democratic shrinkage begin? I suppose it depends what you mean by democracy, and what I would perhaps urge is that we may be seeing a shrinkage of one understanding of democracy in terms of sort of national elective governments, and the extent to which that has ever really sort of enabled self-governance by peoples is very much questionable. And that if you, some of these sorts of alternative community practices may be other means of sort of self-governance that may realize the people's objectives. So I think we should question what we mean by democracy and not just sort of dwell on sort of past structures, and especially those sort of rooted in the sort of European Enlightenment tradition. And then secondly, on the question of transcalar and multidirectional, I would argue it's not just transcalar and multidirectional. We also need to think about how it's both also pluriversal and relational, i.e. it also needs to involve sort of mediating between different worldviews or ways of life, and not just, so it's not just about a certain sort of universal set of values that is with various transcalar and multidirectional linkages.
I'll speak to the last two questions. Ancha, was it from Poland? Yeah. Do these groups, the copycats on the right, to what extent is the left-wing progressive engaging with them? I think there's, I would say, I've seen mixed responses. I think in the US, they move on. The progressive group has taken note, but the copycats none of them have been very effective. They've often kind of fallen apart because the founders have had differences. So they haven't been seen as a big threat to Move On's power, although there are obviously other organizations in the US which are. In the Australian context, there's been a lot more competition because Advance Australia has directly said they're copying. But I think your question gets to a broader point, which is the groups that I've studied, this network of open, feels very threatened by the right and makes a point very often that the right is better organized transnationally than the left. Now, this is, for me as a researcher, an open empirical question. I think it's one that's interesting to explore. I think there's probably instances where that's the case. The copycat phenomenon is a very narrow group of organizations. There's obviously a lot more actors in terms of transnational right-wing organizations or domestic multi-scalar organizations that are engaging. And I do think that we as scholars need to be, just as we study the progressive, or however we want to turn it, global civil society, need to be thinking about what are the infrastructures there. The second question, sorry, I didn't catch your name, was on can campaigns be controlled or co-opted? So I talk in the book a little bit about one of the models I find most promising of digital advocacy organizations, which is they're issue generalists, but they do often campaign and support specialist groups. So to give you a concrete example, in New Zealand, there was a campaign to double the refugee quota. New Zealand has a terribly poor record. We have a lower proportion of refugees per capita than even Australia. People think of New Zealand as this very progressive state. So an individual started a campaign. He was an expert on refugee rights, but he didn't have a big email list. He didn't have a big membership he could appeal to and get behind his campaign, but he was the expert on the issue. And he worked with the group Action Station and set up a campaign that then got thousands of signatories and in the end was successful. So that's an example of an issue-specific group, the Double the Quota group, working with this big petition platform and using it for their campaign. And a lot of other groups around the world have done that, whether it be Get Up in Australia, there's a Dutch group, De Goede Zaak, which works a lot with issue specific. So to my view, when I think about the model that I described, I think it can be really effective if it partners with NGOs that don't have such a broad membership base, and they can both collaborate to sort of correct the limitations of each model, the issue-specific model having a narrower group of members. But yeah, thanks for the questions.
Okay, I want to also respond to Vanessa's question. When did the shrinking of democracy begin? And I absolutely agree with Thomas pointing out that we also have to be critical of all kinds of intents of measuring that and defining democracy, but people have done so. And then I think especially for you as a student, there is a lot of data available on looking into this. And I pointed out the VDEM index, varieties of democracy, one which also get criticized for various issues, but this is where you can really look into a global comparative perspective on when you could see a decline in certain aspects of democracy. I would say, to answer your question, especially with the shrinking civic space that is often directly connected to democracy decline, we had the peak in the 90s, of course, and NGOs became more and more powerful, and that was threatening to a lot of governments. And so you see the first anti-NGO laws appearing in the 2000s, which were also particularly trying to target their funding structure so that external influence, for example, foreign influence would be limited, but at some point also going into what they're actually working on. So I would say look at varieties of a democracy index. Freedom House, I think, is does still a very solid job there. But yeah, I think it's good that we moved on from policy for and so on. But yeah, there is measurements of democracy out there. Yeah, Anna, thank you so much for this question, for the training. That was a very interesting, I could go like very on about this. So it was an online training. It was very popular. A lot of NGOs from the Global South very gratefully accepted this offer, which was for free. And you could really see that a lot of them were operating out of their, well, not even offices, but maybe kitchen and whatever, with not the best internet connection. And I think this was a good example where the law firms tried. So it was through this network of public interest lawyers, PILNet, which really does a good job trying to train towards doing good with pro bono. What I observed, what was my lesson takeaway there, was that all the materials they provided us with in the first place were talking about human rights advocacy, or like advocacy, not necessarily human rights advocacy, but advocacy and doing good from a very legal and corporate perspective. So it was business literature, basically. I never saw anything from the social sciences or from activist scholarship and so on. So I think this was my takeaway, and it was very tailored around this ESG standards. So that's also already, like, I think, pre-selection. And then Giuseppe, yeah, I think here I want to connect. So the funding. So the big question is, what is pro bono? So some of them provide the service for free. Others take maybe a small fee. Others are really just using the money to make way for their interests. I'm just saying that what is pro bono, because this is a question I still have to look in, and we currently, together with a colleague from Paris, Lola Averill, we have a call out right now. You can find it on the center website on what is pro bono, what examples for pro bono are out there. And so if that's something you're working on, please submit an abstract. We will have a beautiful workshop next year in Paris. But one example that also motivated me to work on this proposal for this project is that we have a law firm that was actually offering to build the first environmental administrative court in Ethiopia. And here it included the training of judges and prosecutors, and it was done largely without any local partners, also because we all know that Ethiopia has one of the worst anti-NGO laws in place back then. And this is where I would say they dictated the agenda and said, we have the solution here to train your judges and prosecutors in environmental law, again, corporate lawyers. But I can also say that this project magically disappeared from the pro bono website of this particular law firm. So apparently it was not so successful at all. Yeah, so yeah, thanks again for your questions.
And thank you for your questions. I must say it was very good, very precise and concise questions, and really happy about that. We managed to have quite a few of them. And I would just like to extend a huge thank you to our panel, who I think was really, really interesting. And also I think we got a lot from the discussions here that we will carry with us for the rest of today.